This episode is sponsored by Transcend, a veteran-owned and operated performance optimization company that I introduced recently as a sponsor on this show. Well, since then, I have actually been using my products and I've had incredible success. There was initial blood work that was extremely detailed, and based on that, they offered supplementation. So I began taking DHEA, BPC 157 for inflammation, based on the fact that I've been a stuntman, a martial artist, and a firefighter my whole life. Lots of aches and pains. Dihexa to help cognition after multiple punches to the head and shift work, and peptides. 4 months later, they did a detailed blood work again, and I was actually able to taper off 2 of the peptides because my body had responded so well to just one of them that it was optimized at that point. So I cannot speak highly enough of the immense range of supplementation that they offer, whether it's male health, female health, peptides to boost your own testosterone, which I would argue is needed by a lot of the fire service, or whether it's exogenous testosterone needed, especially after TBIs or advanced age. Now, as I mentioned before, the other side of this company is an altruistic arm called the Transcend Foundation, which is putting veterans and first responders through some of their protocols free of charge. Now, Transcend are also offering you, the audience, 10% off their protocols. And you can find that on jamesgearing.com under the Products tab. And if you want to hear more about Transcend and their story, listen to episode 808 with the founder, Ernie Colling, or go to transcendcompany.com. Welcome to the Behind the Shield podcast. As always, my name's James Gearing, and this week it is my absolute honor to welcome back onto the show psychiatrist and MDMA-led psychotherapy researcher, Dr. Ben Sessa. Now, if you haven't heard my first conversation with Ben, it was episode 156, and I highly recommend you listen to that first. In this second conversation, we discuss a host of topics, from the continued success of using MDMA for trauma and alcoholism, ketamine, psilocybin, ibogaine, the psychedelic renaissance, his new book, and so much more. Now, before we get to this incredible conversation, as I say every week, please just take a moment. Go to whichever app you listen to this on, subscribe to the show, leave feedback, and leave a rating. Every single 5-star rating truly does elevate this podcast, therefore making it easier for others to find. And this is a free library of well over 1,100 episodes now. So all I ask in return is that you help share these incredible men and women's stories so I can get them to every single person on planet Earth who needs to hear them. So with that being said, I welcome back onto the show Dr. Ben Sessa. Enjoy. Well, Ben, I want to start by saying, firstly, thank you so much for coming back onto the Behind the Shield podcast. We spoke on episode 156. I'm now up to over 1,100. So that was a long time ago in the end of 2018. So firstly, I want to welcome you back. Thank you for coming on.
Well, brilliant. Thank you, James. I remember fondly the last session we did. And obviously so much has happened since then. So I'm thrilled to be back here again, giving you and the world a bit of an update on where things are from my perspective. And yeah, what great success on your podcast that we're over 1,100 episodes in now and it's still going strong. So it's a great privilege to be here. Thank you.
Well, we're going to get into that. I think there's a huge amount of success on your end as well. And we'll talk about, obviously, the kind of revolution that's happening in some of these other modalities that are helping in mental health. I think a good kind of jump off point, though, would be to talk about the pandemic. The reason being, whatever people's stance was at that moment in time, there were a few truths that were in the middle, that the healthier the human being, the better the outcome. And then also some of the choices that were made as far as isolation had a ripple effect on society and mental health. And sadly, I don't know if it's the same in the UK, but here as we rounded off the end of that, it was all kind of swept under the rug and no one wanted to talk about it anymore. And I think it does a disservice because people are still dealing with the ripple effects today. So with that being said, what through your eyes was that, pandemic experience like yourself? And then talk to me about what you've seen personally as far as the ripple effect of that.
Yeah, I think it's really good to talk about the pandemic because, as you said, its effect is still huge. And although it may not be so much in the news these days, the devastation that the pandemic caused globally and to individuals is still very much being felt on so many levels. On a societal level and particularly a economic health level, it was obviously absolutely devastating. The incredible amount of money that was spent on the healthcare, how that stripped resources that were already threadbare in the UK mental health services, diverting money into treating COVID. The money that the government spent on the furlough scheme, which all came out of the public purse, again, which has cut to the bone even further the resources available for mental health care. And on an individual level, people are still reeling with a kind of global PTSD from that experience of social isolation, losing their work and their jobs and their businesses, many of which never came back. Particularly in areas like the hospitality sector, they're still crippled. We changed our whole way of life. One of the good things that came out of it were so many podcasts and so many people moving from office work-based environments to home-based environments. I was actually doing telemedicine 5 years before the pandemic. So I was very much used to doing telemedicine on Zoom and other platforms. And then since then, it's just become very commonplace for mental health care personnel to work from home. Now, there's pros and cons of that. I mean, I remember when the telemedicine and psychiatry started, I was one of the people saying that's absurd. It can never work. You need that personal face-to-face contact with a patient in the room. You couldn't possibly do it by Zoom. But actually, there are pros and cons. Yes, you do lose that personal touch to some extent, but there's gains as well. If a patient has an appointment with their psychiatrist and they've waited months and months, and it's a 1-hour appointment, they have to take the whole day off work. They have to drive somewhere. They have to park. It's very expensive. And a lot of patients really prefer jumping on a Zoom call for their psychiatric assessment. And although there are bits missing, I think on balance, it's increased accessibility to many patients. So it's now very commonplace for mental health professionals to do on remote assessments and evaluations and monitoring of patients. And I think that does work, but it's not a complete substitute for the level of care that a psychiatric patient needs. So we're still reeling from that. We also see a large proportion of patients who are reeling from the physical effects of COVID. And we're learning more and more about the mental syndromes that accompany long COVID. But I think the biggest thing is just the effect economically, and the mental health issues as an epidemic were already on the rise. They have been for decades. But since so many people lost their work and their income, and with that, their resources and their self-esteem and their accessibility to getting help, it's just gone through the roof. So many of the patients that I see in my private practice now, the first thing they say when they sign up is, I tried to go to the NHS, but it just doesn't exist. There, of course, is an NHS mental health care service, and it's very good in some places, but it's very patchy. And obviously, with the high level of resources, demand rather, and the low level of resources, the bar is set very high to get into NHS mental health care services. So really, you have to be psychotic and suicidal to get through the door, which is very frustrating. When I trained as a doctor and then as a psychiatrist getting on 30 years ago, the whole model and standard of care was just different from what you do now. There's no way you'd get through the door in NHS services with just low or moderate levels of anxiety or depression. You have to be very severe to even get through the door. So for me in private practice, this has opened up a lot more patients. But it's very sad that so many people can't get the care and support they need. And of course, it's a double whammy because there's a much higher mental health care need amongst people in lower socioeconomic groups with lower incomes. And so they can't afford to go private, so they just don't have healthcare at all. And I think you're in the States, aren't you? So, you know more than pretty much any other nation on the planet what it's like to live in a nation that doesn't really have a public healthcare system. I think in the UK we have one better than America. I think Malawi has a better public healthcare system than the United States, with some 71 million people with no access to any healthcare at all, is a headline I read the other day about the States. But yeah, just to bring us round to psychedelics, this is where, faced with these kinds of challenges in mental health care, we need to be thinking outside the box about what can we do differently? What can be a game changer in improving the nation's mental health? And I hope we're going to get on to talking about psychedelics in that respect.
Yeah, absolutely. Just before we do, though, firstly, the telehealth element. This obviously really was something, I think, from what I was told by a lot of people, a lot of the red tape around telehealth was cut around COVID. So people have said this was one of the good things that came out of it. And now, even from 911 or 999, you have the abuse of ambulance, fire, police. You have the ability now to integrate into the dispatch system where someone calls with a low acuity call or a low acuity mental health issue, that's not, a psychotic episode or something that would warrant us to really go there and medicate whatever it is that we have to do. And now that person can sit in their home and they can speak to an ER, nurse or whatever the person is. And then that will be a kind of treat at home element. But also, when I look now at all the incredible conversations I've had, 95% of them have been exactly how we're doing it now, because I always say I don't let geography get in the way of a good conversation. Yeah, the depths that some of these people go to via this screen, and a number of times I've been told that was like a therapy session, thank you. But it's through the screen. But if you can connect and you can stay engaged, it is. I mean, the gold standard obviously is sitting in a desk in a room across from each other. But it's not that far down as far as, being present via a screen and being able to listen. And like you said, I think you offset that with the ease of access. Like we jumped on this, and then the moment we hang up, we're both going to go and do something else now. It really does kind of illustrate how powerful this medium is. And again, as far as the finances attributed to it, it's cutting a lot of costs just to be able to sit in your office and for me to sit here. And whether it's an interview or a counseling session, both of us, it makes it affordable from that point of view.
Yeah. And, as you said, that's a benefit of using this technology. And I think it's taught us all a lot, because I suppose we were all quite Luddite about it in thinking it could never possibly work. And actually, we've all surprised ourselves to find it does work. In fact, it's sometimes superior for all the reasons you mentioned. So, yeah, that's the world in which we live. I mean, that's not an excuse to keep cutting mental health services. People with severe mental health problems require holistic care, multidisciplinary holistic care. People in their local area, a district, a community nurse, a consultant psychiatrist, a general practitioner, a community day hospital, as well as inpatient services, that whole cluster of multidisciplinary inputs. And of course, remote sessions like this can be part of that. But it's not a substitute for all those other parts of care for those patients with severe mental health problems that really need all those other parts as well.
Well, before we go into the world of psychedelics, one more area, because, I mean, you and I grew up in the same area. Well, you're in the same area now. I was from Bath originally, and we're about the same age. And I talk very fondly about the NHS that we grew up in, the 70s and the 80s, and the philosophy that a nation would band together and take care of anyone who needed help at that moment, whether it was a pregnant, family, or whether it was someone that was hit by a car, whatever the thing was, we all take care of everyone. I think that's the ultimate, it takes a village mentality. But what I've seen now, as I sit here 51 years old with, fire experience and all these other things that I've done, and you see the NHS picked apart, the only way that system is going to work well is, as you said, holistic, proactive, preventative practices. So you keep the nation healthy so they don't need the NHS until absolutely necessary. But I've seen the opposite. And when I go home now, it's heartbreaking. I mean, not only the mental health elements, but also the obesity that's crippling our nation now as well. So through your lens, how has this devolution happened? And if you were king for a day, how can we reverse it? Because I would argue it's at its core, the best healthcare system on the planet when it was originally conceived and fully funded.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I don't pretend to be an expert in this. Obviously, as a consultant with 30 years experience in medicine, I've got a pretty good opinion on it. But I'm not an expert in health economics. It's quite clear that it's not working at the moment. I guess one way of looking at the NHS and what went wrong and why we're in this position is actually really simple. When the NHS was set up in 1948, medicine was a far simpler place than it is today. We only had 2 or 3 antibiotics. We had 2 or 3 painkillers. We had a bunch of operations, surgical operations, which you could have a long rehab process for and stay in hospital for 12 weeks, to have your leg mended. It's changed beyond recognition with technology that's very expensive, pharmacology that's very expensive. Some oncology treatments are £1,800 per pill. None of that existed. It was affordable to provide the healthcare for the nation in 1948 based on simple taxes. The cost of medicine now is infinite. We can keep people alive indefinitely, depending on how much money we want to pump into them. So this makes me sound very non-socialist because I'm very much a socialist. But there is a real argument for, in today's consumerist, very expensive, complex society, there simply is no room for free, universal, unlimited healthcare. It just doesn't work as a commercial model. Now that makes me sound very unsocialist, and that kind of comment would make me very unpopular with the basic narrative of the NHS, which is free, universal healthcare to everyone at the point of need for their whole life, no matter what they do with their life. And here's an even more contentious thing. Should the NHS be lifestyle means tested? I'm asking you this. Should it be fair that one person can smoke 80 cigarettes a day and drink 2 liters of vodka a day, eat lots of fatty food, become obese and never go to the gym, develop hypertension and obesity and diabetes by the age of 50, and then expect free, unlimited healthcare for those conditions for the next 30 or 40 years? And another person meticulously decides not to smoke, not to drink, go to the gym, eat all their vegetables and salads, and doesn't require any healthcare really at all until they're in their late 80s. What do you think? I know that's a very unsocialist thing to say, but is it a realistic thing to say? Should there be a lifestyle means test for access to healthcare? Now, the socialists would say absolutely not. It doesn't matter if you smoke and drink. You should still get free healthcare because that's what the NHS is. But I don't know. What do you think?
So it's interesting because I'm person B in that example. So aside from, drinking once in a while in the evenings, the rest of the stuff is me. I don't ever see a doctor. I have, blood work done frequently. I adjust my nutrition accordingly. But I use this as a comparison a lot because this is something that people talk about, who deserves, the healthcare versus who doesn't. I grew up on a farm outside Bath, and, we had livestock on the farm that we would eat. We had a vegetable garden, we had an orchard. My day comprised of, mucking out stables and herding geese and all these other things. So my baseline was forging health, the activity level, understanding where the food came from, cooking whole food, basically almost never had any sort of fast food whatsoever. And then you compare someone who grew up in inner city London, and they grew up in a flat, their local food was probably fish and chips or whatever it was. Their parents smoked, so they passively became addicted and they became smokers themselves, yada, yada, yada. So you have two children on two different paths. So I think that, with this one or the other conversation always, ends up with no resolution versus they're both correct. 100% is on the ownership of the individual, but what is the environment like? In America, everything's fast food, everything on every corner, drive through everything. Even the PE programs at school have been sliced and diced. They serve processed food in school cafeterias.
Yeah, there is no simple answer. It's not either or. And of course, when it comes to that question of who deserves healthcare, obviously everyone deserves healthcare. Also, another way of looking at this is that lifestyle is already taxed. When you buy alcohol, you're paying for liver units. When you buy cigarettes, you're paying for respiratory services. So I don't know whether when you buy fried chicken at McDonald's, you're paying for obesity and diabetes care. I'm not sure how that would work. But we're in a very difficult position. And I think going back to mental health care specifically, if you don't have an acute service, if you can't catch people early on, it's almost not worth having something at all. If you go to your GP and you're complaining of depression and anxiety and you're miserable and you've lost your partner and your children and your job, and you're told, yeah, that's fine, well, I'll get you an NHS appointment, it'll be 3 years. That's almost, there's no point, because all of those acute things will have passed. You need the help when you need it. And I think this is why we are spiraling downwards in terms of our management of the health of the nation in terms of mental health, which is why we need something innovative and effective, fast working and efficient and financially efficient. And psychedelics do bring us all of that.
Well, let's take a deep dive then. The first time, obviously, we spoke about some of these areas, but so much has changed now. So many more studies, so much more, even just advocation, I guess is the best word, since the last time we sat down in 7 years. I think it's been a real kind of renaissance since then. So talk to me first. Let's start with MDMA, because obviously that was the one that we really honed in last time. That's ironically a compound that I have used recreationally in the past. Is something that I actually want to pursue myself as far as the MDMA counseling, just to see if there's anything underlying. There's nothing that really troubles me specifically, but knowing the life that I've had, I got a funny feeling there's probably some boxes in there that are still locked tight. So let's start with MDMA. What's been the kind of evolution since the last time we spoke 7 years ago?
Well, it's an interesting question, and it's a sort of both a positive and a not so positive answer. In terms of MDMA being a licensed prescribable medicine, it's still not. So in some ways, we're no further ahead now than we were 20 years ago or 30 years ago when the research started. In order to get a drug licensed as a medicine with a capital M, so this means a legal licensed medicine. I'm not talking about underground or illegal use here, because that's just a different kettle of fish. But for a drug to be a licensed legal medicine, it has to jump through a whole bunch of hoops. And these hoops are not specific to psychedelics. They're the same for painkillers and antibiotics and cancer drugs, the same set of research hoops. It has to jump through all those hoops. And then you have to submit to, in America, the FDA. And then they accept the drug or not, and it becomes an approved medicine. Until it's an approved medicine, it can only be used in a research setting under research protocols, which is a very small number, a couple of dozen of patients, very expensive to run research studies. The leading organization in the world for MDMA research is called MAPS, as you know, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and they've been carrying out all of these research protocols, jumping through all these hoops. And then last year in 2024, they submitted all of their data to the FDA and it was turned down. So that was after 20, 30 years and $100 million plus of research costs. The FDA turned it down on, quite frankly, rather spurious criteria. And so as we're sitting here today, MDMA is still not over the line as a licensed legal medicine. And that's true throughout Europe, throughout the States, Canada, United, South America, anywhere. Anyone that says they are legally prescribing MDMA, they are not. It is illegal unless they are a researcher and they're doing this under research and the patients are participants in a research trial. Now, there is a slight caveat to that in that what's happened a couple of years ago in Australia is that MDMA and psilocybin were given a special, not a full medical license, but an approval to be used in large numbers of people. And so in Australia, MDMA is available in a number of clinics. And I was very privileged a couple of years ago to go out to Australia on 2 separate occasions for about 10 weeks each to take part in training schemes. So there's a furious rush in Australia to get lots of people trained, doctors, nurses, therapists, to deliver MDMA therapy in Australia for Australian nationals. So it's really moving ahead in Australia, which is kind of ironic because Australia has always just been a backwater in terms of psychedelic research, but it suddenly leapt into front position with this government initiative. But in the United States and Europe, MDMA is still not a licensed legal medicine. Now, the setback that MAPS had in summer 24, it means they've got to redo some of their studies. And I think the last I heard from Rick Doblin was it's going to be another 2 or 3 years and another however many tens of millions of dollars to then get that data again, then resubmit and hopefully get approval. And then once it gets approved as a medicine, then practitioners with the appropriate training and support and facilities can use it as a medicine, not just as a research investigative tool. So in answer to your question, in some ways, we're no better off now than we were when I last spoke to you. In other ways, an awful lot has happened. And there's an awful lot more people trained to deliver MDMA therapy now. And certainly the public perception is further along positively. There's much less stigma. There's much more public acceptance. And there's much greater need. We are more than ever in need of MDMA-assisted psychedelic therapy than we were back then. We're just waiting for that green light from the approval services to start opening clinics and delivering the treatments.
It's funny you say that because I am literally about to interview an Australian firefighter who did MDMA in Australia and had incredible results. And funnily enough, we were talking, and I'll get to this in a minute, but you hear some of these places that offer these treatments, as you said, whether it's legally or illegally. Ketamine is a good example. Obviously, it's legal here. And every time I've heard someone say with ketamine, oh, it didn't work, usually they were hooked up to an IV and the person walked out. They weren't doing any sort of kind of guiding or counseling alongside. But his experience with MDMA, he was, extremely well researched. I mean, he's doing a master's on this at the moment, I believe. So had an excellent grasp on all these therapeutic modalities. Went in thinking, okay, my relationship with the counselor is strong. This is what's going to be the winning factor. And actually, he said the medicine was actually really what did most of it. He was quiet and in his own head for most of the time. So I'm actually going to be able to storytell an Australian firefighter success story with MDMA literally in a few weeks.
Yeah, and there's a real debate raging at the moment in psychedelics in terms of the narrative has always been it's a combination of the drug and the psychotherapy, and the drug opens the door, primes the brain, a process called neuroplasticity or neuroflexibility. And then when the brain is in that neuroplastic or neuroflexible state, you throw the psychotherapy at them, and that's where you get the great results. And that's always been the model. But we're starting also to challenge that. And more people are finding, certainly with neuroscientific studies, that simply taking the drug without psychotherapy is also highly beneficial because of that neuroplastic effect that it has. And we've learned a lot of this from ketamine, interestingly. So, I mean, we can certainly talk about ketamine because you're quite right. So ketamine, as you know, is a licensed medicine. It doesn't have to go through that approval process of becoming a licensed medicine. It's been around since the 1970s as a anesthetic, and it's a very, very important and useful anesthetic. It's used all over the world. In fact, it's on the World Health Organization, their list of top 10 essential drugs that every country must have, up there with morphine and penicillin. It's a very useful anesthetic. And then around about 2001, it was serendipitously found to be that it also worked to reduce depression. It was found by an anesthetist who was prescribing it for his anesthetic, for his surgical patients. And he found that those with depression had a better mood for a week afterwards, after this infusion of ketamine. And so we then saw this springing up of its use in psychiatry. And yeah, the beginning of these so-called ketamine clinics, it was just getting the infusion. You would go along to the clinic, there'd be no psychotherapy, you would have an IV drip, it would last a couple of hours. The practitioner would say to you, "Oh, I'm really sorry, you're going to feel a bit weird for a couple of hours, but don't worry, it'll pass." And then the antidepressant effects will start in a few hours later, and it'll last a week or so. So that's what most of these ketamine clinics were. But then what we've seen in more recent years is using MDMA like we would use psilocybin or MDMA, not considering the intoxication as just an irritating side effect of feeling a bit weird, but actually a positive mental state that we can work in and alongside. So combining that with psychotherapy like we would for MDMA and psilocybin. And this is called CAP, ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, as opposed to just what we would call RAAD, rapid-acting antidepressant effects. And more and more we're seeing CAP being used. But I think you're right. I think the vast majority of so-called ketamine clinics, even today, are not doing CAP. They're just giving the infusions. Now it's not a bad thing, you know. It's a good antidepressant. The trouble is you have to keep doing it. It's a maintenance therapy. You might do it once a week, once a fortnight, once a month, but you have to keep topping up in that way. It's a bit like dialysis for the brain. Whereas when you combine it with psychotherapy in the form of CAP, the hypothesis is that, like MDMA and psilocybin, you make important realizations, reflections on aspects of your psychology that were stuck. And the psychotherapy is much more effective and long-lasting without having to repeat it. So it's really ironic that right now, when most people think of psychedelic therapy, they probably think of ketamine therapy because it's by far the most used. It's the license and it's used all over the world. But if you take those three psychedelics, ketamine, psilocybin, and MDMA, I would argue that ketamine is the poor cousin of MDMA and psilocybin when it comes to agents to assist psychotherapy. It's good, ketamine therapy. It's better than no ketamine, but it's no MDMA and it's no psilocybin. But ironically, it's the one everyone's got. So, you know, if we could have made that choice, 20 years ago, which of those three should we have? It wouldn't be ketamine, but it is ketamine because it's already licensed. And so we're honing ways to do ketamine-assisted psychotherapy better and better and make it more effective. But like you said about your patient who was the firefighter, a lot of people come out of the ketamine experience saying, it's all right, but, it wasn't mind-blowing. Whereas with MDMA or psilocybin, they pretty much all, without exception, say that was profound and mind-blowing. And with MDMA particularly, it was also very pleasant and tolerable. And they immediately talk about the amazing gains they've made. So now there are no magic wands in mental health at all. But if there was one, it would be MDMA.
It's interesting because someone asked me the other day, something to do with psychedelics. And I had this realization because on this journey that I'm on, and I'm, advocating for all these things when it comes to, the physical health, the mental health, one of the questions is, well, why am I not struggling? I'm no more, no different a human being than all of the men and women I know that have been, suffering alcoholism, they've taken their own lives, et cetera, et cetera. Now, part of it is definitely my upbringing, going back to that farm. I was surrounded by a lot of things that we know are very healing, but there was a lot of trauma. I almost died in a house fire when I was 4 years old. Parents had a horrible divorce. There was another near-death incident. So there's a lot of compounding things, big T's and little T's. But when I lived in Japan, mushrooms were legal. So, and then MDMA wasn't, but we did it anyway. But it was in a kind of, the rave setting, as it were. So legalization aside, I was exposed to MDMA and psilocybin during those times. And it wasn't specifically to deal with trauma, but I wonder again if, just by osmosis, there was a healing element of that. So you've got the holistic healing that offset the childhood. Then you've got exposure to these two compounds that we're talking about today, which ironically, when I was honest about my very first firefighter application, which I hadn't done them for years, I basically had the application screwed up and thrown in my face. And now here we are talking about how effective they are to heal first responders. So it's kind of ironic, but I wonder if, that was one of the reasons why after a 14-year career, with arguably, a decent amount of trauma, that I was able to be in a slightly better place than some of my peers.
Well, I don't want to take the wind out of your sails with that idea, James. But I would say what we know about the etiology of mental health problems and the prevalence of mental health problems amongst different groups and what are the big causative factors. By far, the two biggest factors are probably initially genetics, which of course you have no control over. It's the genes you're given. And the other is your very early attachment experiences. So, what happens in your first 48 months of life in terms of that nurturing experience with your primary caregiver. So if you get that right and you've got good genes, the likelihood of you having a resilient adult mental health for the rest of your life is by far the biggest factors. It's a nice romantic idea to think that your exposure to recreational MDMA and psilocybin later in life has had a bolstering effect. And maybe it has. And, of all people, it should be someone like me who would say that's true. It certainly could have had a positive effect, and to continue to do so and to continue to use it in a healthy, facilitated way is a healthy thing to do. But when you actually look at the prevalence and etiology of mental health disorders, I think those other two factors, genetics and very early attachment, are the biggest protective factors. Get those right, and we are resilient to adult mental health problems far more so than people who don't have those parts. Which is why, we can't do much about genetics, at least not easily or ethically. But we can certainly do something about attachment. And often I say in my talks, we could close half of the prisons and half of the hospitals tomorrow if we had really good care for single mothers with children under 5. Because get those early attachment years right. Attachment becomes this blueprint for the rest of your life. The experiences you have in those pre-verbal years become the blueprint, the benchmark for every aspect of our psychology. Trust, love, fear, acceptance, violence, aggression, addiction, all of those things are very, very early imprinted in that pre-verbal child. And we can do something about that with really, really good public health care and support for single parents, not just mothers, usually mothers, but single parents and children. But yeah, ongoing adult support with psychedelics is another great way of mopping up some of the difficulties when you haven't got those kind of resiliences.
Well, when we say genetics, there's more and more discussion now of epigenetics. And again, before we hit record, I was talking about the book I just wrote and the multi-generational trauma. One of the very snide comments that you hear now is, well, the problem today is these broken families. And it's like, yes, it is. But what are we going to do about that? This is a generational issue, as you said, whether it's addiction, whether it's incarceration. There are a lot of families that, that's already happened to them. But I believe that if we start healing these households with all these initiatives that we're talking about, whether it's, taking care of, the households that need more care, the Norwegian, prison model where we're truly rehabilitating people so that they come back and become functioning members of society. The the Finnish education system, the Portuguese decriminalization system, where you're holistically healing a nation. I believe that epigenetics will be where now you have the opposite effect, and you start, reducing the amount of people that have prevalence for, addiction, alcoholism, etc.
Yeah. No, I mean, absolutely. There's no doubt that maximizing all of those social measures improves outcome for mental health and physical health illnesses. There's no question. All of these illnesses cluster in the lower social economic groups, whether it's epigenetics or just epi-socialization. I think is, I think if you live in poverty and you don't have further education and you can't find employment, and nor could your father, and nor could your grandfather or his father, is that epigenetics, or is that just transgenerational poor social conditions? I think it's probably the latter. Whether that's imprinted into the genetic code or not is almost irrelevant. I think that the effect of that would be tiny compared to the very obvious in-your-face issue of we live in poverty and all these generations have. And I don't know that there's much of genetic tweaking that needs to be done there. You just need to look after these groups from a social and economic perspective. But yeah, I mean, epigenetics is a field that is fascinating to study and understand. Personally, my understanding of it is that the effect is not nearly as great as some of the things we actually know loads about, which is the social situation and the effect that has on transgenerational populations of children becoming adults, having children, etc. So epigenetics is an interesting field, but not as interesting as good education and employment and tackling poverty on a social level. I think that's my personal opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, the statement about, which label is irrelevant if we find solutions, proactive solutions. And I think this is underlined, ironically, circling around to the FDA, who approved OxyContin. Where we saw the highest prevalence of addiction were places where there used to be a high level of industry. And then it was taken away, whether it was mining towns or the steel industry or the auto industry. So was it, an addictive hook that those people all had genetically, or was, as you pointed to, a lack of community, a lack of stability financially that then created this void that then, they were far more susceptible to this FDA approved painkiller. And then ironically, MDMA is not approved.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually both, because what we see in genetics is what's called a genetic drift of the genes are not equally spread amongst the environment. The genes for depression, anxiety, personality disorders, addictions, psychosis, PTSD, all of these genes cluster in the poor areas because over the generations, you slip off that social ladder and find yourself living in the ghetto. And so it would, all the nice posh kids that go to the posh schools and have the wonderful parenting and all the money and the jobs and the university and the brilliant support systems, they've got all the best genes in that part of town, in the nice part of town. And that difficult part of town with transgenerational drug misuse, addiction, poverty, unemployment, poor education, that's where depression, anxiety, PTSD genes cluster over the generations because you slip down. That's called genetic drift. So yeah, I mean, this is highly unethical. But if one way of tackling this is to have this kind of eugenics scheme where you get all the nice posh people to mate with all the poor people in the difficult part of town and spread the genes around. Now, of course, that's an absurd idea. But yeah, what this conversation is pointing out is the double, triple, quadruple whammy that comes when you look at risk of mental health prevalence. It's not ever as simple as just the genes, just the childhood, just the environment. Most of the patients that I would see in secondary or tertiary mental health services have multiple risk factors. They've got the poor genes, the poor environment, the poor parenting, the poor childhood, the trauma, all of those things. Because any one of those getting it right acts as a very strong protective factor against developing the end phenotype, which is the mental disorder. So, you can protect against it So we have to do what we can do, and we can't do much about the genetics at this stage. But we, like you said, I think we both agree, the things we can do something about is where we should be targeting our resources.
I don't know if I asked you this back in 2018, so I will again, because this is, again, when you've done over 1,000 interviews, the Venn diagram intersects pretty profoundly, and you see these truths really arise because these people are from, all walks of life all over the globe. But, the conversation around that time in my profession was, we've got to smash the stigma. It's okay not to be okay. All these kind of, buzz phrases. But one of the ones that I saw or heard over and over and over again that I just don't hear discussed, and I feel like it needs to be front and center, was the feeling of burdensome. And when, just as you alluded to, these first responders have that perfect storm, when from their early life, the trauma that we see, the sleep deprivation, the organizational betrayal, the side effects of alcohol, psych meds, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they get to this point, the voice in their head has literally distorted their reality to the point where they truly believe that if they just took themselves out of the equation, that their family would be better off, that would solve the problem. And you have a profession where we train diligently not to die. And I always say, if you stand on the top of a high-rise building and go near the edge, there's an invisible hand like pushing you back. I feel like through this change of, brain chemistry, psychology, that hand almost goes behind you and is pushing you towards the edge now. So in all the people that you hear that are really getting close to that suicidal point, talk to me about that distorted reality and that belief that they are the problem, and if they just take their own life, everyone will be better. Because we've talked about suicide being cowardly and selfish. But when you hear these people, some of whom have survived their attempts that have been on the show, you realize at that moment in that distorted mind, it was actually a courageous and selfless act, even though to a healthy mind, it made no sense.
Yeah, it's such a difficult subject to talk about. And especially if somebody's lost a loved one to suicide themselves. And of course, in some ways, it's a moot point because we don't know the psychology and the cognitions of a person who completes suicide. We can't. We can know those that attempt suicide and don't complete it. And then indeed they say the things like you're saying. They may do it to escape their own pain. And the commonest thing you hear is, I just want the pain to stop. And this will make the pain stop. And again, another reason you might say is not just for me, but I want the pain to stop for those other people because I'm also causing them pain. But of course, as you rightly say, when a person dies from suicide, that causes immense pain to all these people they were hoping to protect. So it's very hard to know what's actually happening. I think the other side, the sort of existential philosophical side, is I suppose everybody does have that option to live or die by their hand. And in some strange way, we have to almost respect that decision, ghastly though it is, when someone is in such a position that they take that decision. And, we're mental health workers because we don't believe that is ever the right decision. And there has to be an alternative to that. But there is also that in the mix, that it is a philosophical decision for a person to make. And of course, not all people who take their lives have mental illness. Some people do decide to make that decision in a degree of clear consciousness. I think it's relatively rare. And of course, we wouldn't be doing our jobs as psychiatrists if we believed that was a reasonable way out. But yeah, when you look at society, and particularly post-COVID, and then really sadly, you throw in the fact that people are not getting resources and not getting access to support and care, more and more people are thinking that is a valid way out to end their pain and to end the pain of others. And it's tragic. That's tragic.
Yeah, I mean, you just alluded, exactly to the point that I'm hearing is the people that actually went through with it. Kevin Hines when he left the Golden Gate Bridge, Emma Benoit when she pulled the trigger. Immediately, there's this kind of return to the original state, to their healthy mind state, and it's like, no, I don't want to do this, and thank God they survived. But you hear, especially with the use of alcohol as well, there's that blurring of consciousness by that point. So yeah, if you got someone who's got ALS and they're end stage and they choose euthanasia, and it's with a healthy mind, absolutely, that should 100% be everyone's choice. But it's when the unhealthy mind is telling them lies that I think that your profession and the other world of psychology and psychedelics, that's where we're able, I hope, to pull the people back from the edge, restore their original frame of mind, and then hopefully they'll be like, oh, thank God I didn't do that. That would have been a mistake.
But like you say, the acute event itself is very, very often associated with alcohol or other drugs, because of their disinhibiting effect. So not just having an addiction to those to substances and all of the destruction that causes, but the acute event, the disinhibition. I mean, we've all said and done things when drunk that we wouldn't have done when sober. And that also accounts for self-harm and completed suicide. I'm not sure what the figure is. I think it's something like 90% of suicides, the patient is intoxicated with alcohol. Don't quote me on that, but it's very high. Yeah. But then we all get drunk and we don't all try and kill ourselves. So it's not that the two go together. It's obviously rooted in longer term mental health problems and strife. And that's where we can intervene. I think one thing that I've just reminded of in what we're talking about here is you talk about those people who came back from an almost completed suicide with a new life or a new lifestyle or a new reflection. I've always been sort of cautious about that narrative that somehow awful trauma makes you stronger. I hate that phrase, that doesn't kill me makes me stronger. It's not true. In the majority of cases, that doesn't kill me gives me PTSD and heroin addiction. It's a bit of a romantic idea that when we're stressed and we're pushed and we lose our jobs and we lose our money and we lose our family and we lose our hope, that somehow there's this amazing ray of sunshine that comes out of such adversity and means, oh, now we're going to be okay because we've experienced such lows. That's not what the statistics show us. Adversity causes pain. It's a very Hollywood Disney idea that extreme adversity turns you into a strong fighter. It usually doesn't. It usually kills you. Why do we avoid adversity? Because it kills us. And I think going back to what you said about the idea of reducing stigma, part of that is being able to say, I am really, really unwell and really unhappy, and no, I haven't been made stronger by losing my job, my money, my family. It hasn't turned me into this, wow, everything's going to be great now. It's actually killing me, and I might die from it. And I think sometimes sufferers of PTSD, they see that sort of Hollywood Disney message that adversity will make you strong. It doesn't usually. It usually kills you. That's why it's adverse. I don't know what you think about that. Do you get what I'm saying there?
I think, well, so those events, it was immediately like the split second after the suicide attempt that they had this no moment. So it wasn't like they suddenly were stronger. Where I see the strength, and I've talked about this a lot, and I think this is what we need from the mental health conversation now, is where that strength is gained is that journey, MDMA, whatever the toolbox that you choose, that healing journey, that growth journey. Because that adverse event, I agree with you 100%, was horrible. That's why it's a trauma. But doing the work then, and obviously, ultimately, you're going to unpack in my profession, well, it's not just that horrible car crash that we went to. It's actually, this happened when I was a child, and this relationship issue and this financial issue, and then you start addressing the laundry list of other things that you've kind of buried down in the past. So I think that's the hope of post-traumatic growth, is the journey that you go, the healing journey. And then being James 2.0, not like I'm 18-year-old James or 12-year-old James. I'm a totally different person. But I think then seeing those people that have gone through it, the empathy, the compassion, it's not that they're bulletproof anymore. It's just that they've been there. It's kind of that analogy with the man in the hole, the man jumps down. He's like, why did you jump in with me? He said, because I've been here before. I know how to get out. That to me is the kind of post-traumatic growth, not as you said, oh, because I lost my child, now that was a gift from God and now I'm going to have this superpower. I think it's just these traumas send us on this healing journey, and that's really what the superpower is.
You're absolutely right. So the adversity and the trauma itself is not inherently strengthening. It's inherently damaging. But what you do with it afterwards can result in this kind of epiphany of new direction in life. I mean, we're in agreement here, and we take these things for granted now with our understanding of trauma. But it wasn't that long ago that even science didn't see things like that. The Victorians talked about tough love. It's good to beat children. It's good for them. It makes them strong. And that's where this phrase, that didn't kill me made me strong. This is where that phrase came from. The idea that adversity is somehow good and to be welcomed. And we have thankfully moved on from that, because most of the time it doesn't result in good outcomes. It results in poor outcomes. So we have moved on. By far the best way to make a child strong is to love them and cuddle them and praise them and give them a nice, warm, gentle life. That's the way to make a child strong, not to hurt them and humiliate them and beat them up to make them tough. But, like I said, it wasn't long ago in society and in the psychiatry that we didn't see things like that.
I use that example with Victorian times. That's when we used to have children in factories and going up chimneys at 5 years old. So just because that's the way they used to do it doesn't mean it's right.
No. But, then if you look at it the other way, paradoxically, look at the high levels of mental illness that we seem to have.
Well, with that being said, what about the prevalence in knife crime and those kind of things that we're seeing? What's your perspective through a psychiatrist lens as far as the root cause of this violence that our children are seeming to lean into now?
I think, again, it's multiple factors. I would say it's probably more than anything, it's psychosocial factors of just economics and poverty and poor education and lack of opportunity. Knife crime exists amongst richer kids, but it's much, much smaller. And then you've got the internet, the media, the glamorization of that. It's really scary for young people. I've got teenage children, and it's really scary to think that they could be involved in, a skirmish on the street at night and could be stabbed. I'd like to think that, my children wouldn't instigate such a thing, but they could be a victim of it, But of course, it could be anybody. So, yeah, these things they go hand in hand with social deprivation and social stress. And I think, I don't know enough about this in terms of the clear data, but I think that from what I understand, issues like the glamorization in certain aspects of the media and the access to the internet augment the problem, as far as I can understand. But that's kind of a lay opinion.
Shifting back to MDMA, and then we'll get to the book. I remember in our first conversation, that it was originally a marriage counseling style drug. So I'm assuming back then there was a level of approval. So how is a drug that was for a while actually approved to being used then demonized to the point where even in 2025 you guys can't get it regulated again?
Well, it was never approved. It's never been approved. It's just it wasn't an illegal substance on the list of banned substances. So MDMA therapy came to the fore in the sort of mid to late 70s. And it was taken up particularly by a group of psychotherapists who had been LSD therapists in the 60s. So, of course, LSD psychotherapy became a relatively big thing in psychiatry in the late 50s and early 60s. and it was being used on tens of thousands of patients, and it was effective, and it was safe, and it was doing well. And then, of course, the 1960s drug revolution happened, and Timothy Leary and psychedelia and the rest of it. LSD was banned pretty much everywhere by the end of the 60s, and the doctors and the therapists stopped using it. Of course, the banning did nothing to stop the recreational use, which kind of spiraled ever since. So banning things doesn't make them go away, but it does make respectable people like doctors not use them if they're told they're not allowed to. So MDMA came in the late 70s. It had been around since 1912, but it wasn't really a recreationally used drug. It was pretty much unheard of until it was rediscovered, if you like, by a chap called Sasha Shulgin, who introduced it to another psychotherapist called Leo Zeff, and he was using it. He was previously an LSD psychotherapist, and he'd stopped using LSD when it was banned. But then when he was introduced to MDMA, it wasn't a banned substance. It wasn't even a known substance. So it wasn't that it was licensed. It's just that it wasn't banned. And then lots of success with thousands of patients. But then MDMA went broadly the same direction as LSD had done 10, 15, 20 years earlier. It leaked from the medical community, started turning up in nightclubs and police seizures, and then it became banned in 1985. And then since then, that's when Rick Doblin set up MAPS in 1985-86. And since then, he and MAPS have been working to unban it, if you like, and get it licensed as a medicine. That's where we are today. It's still not quite over the line. There's been lots and lots of research over the last 20, 30 years. Hundreds, thousands of patients have been treated legally with MDMA in research settings, but it's still not over the line as a licensed medicine.
What are you seeing as far as the resistance? Like, for example, I've had a few guests on when it comes to CBD, literally hemp-based, therapeutic plant medicine, no kind of real psychoactive effect whatsoever, and they've had such resistance. Now, my perspective is obviously there's so much money in other drugs, you can see that there would be pressure from markets that would be threatened if addiction, mental health were vastly improved in a much smaller amount of, therapeutic applications. From behind the scenes, why is there so much resistance to, whether it's Iboga, MDMA, psilocybin, these compounds that are clearly having a lot of effects, as you said, whether it's 100 year of the drugs being here or in some of these plant medicines, even thousands of years?
Yeah. I mean, my sense is there isn't actually lots of resistance. It just simply hasn't jumped through the hoops and got the approval. Sometimes people say, hey, man, the reason governments ban LSD and magic mushrooms is because they know that if people's eyes were opened and they became enlightened by these compounds, they would rise up against the governments and be free. I just don't believe that for a second. I think that is massively flattering the intelligence of governments that they have that kind of a narrative going on. I would be incredibly impressed if there's members of the government saying that we can't let psychedelics become legal because then everyone would rise. That's absurd. The reason psychedelics are not legal is because the governments have no idea about their benefit and potential. The reason they're illegal is because they think of them as crack and heroin. They think that magic mushrooms, MDMA and psilocybin are the same as crack and heroin. They're killer, dangerous, addictive drugs, and that's why they're not being used. It's not because they're trying to save themselves from the magical therapeutic properties of these drugs. If only they were so bright and astute to be banning them for that reason. So the reason they haven't got over the line is they simply haven't jumped through the hoops that are required for licensed medicines. Now, it is more complex than that. Why have they not jumped through the hoops? Because they haven't had the money spent on them to jump them through the hoops. It's incredibly expensive to get a drug to market, whether it's an antibiotic, an analgesic, a cancer drug, or a psychedelic. Doesn't matter. It's the same rules for all of those. There's not extra rules for psychedelics. All of those different compounds of drug have to jump through the same hoops to get licensed, and it costs loads of money. It costs $150 million, and it takes 15, 20, 25 years. So we're just on that journey. Now, it's certainly, on the other hand, arguable that because there is a stigma around these drugs, perhaps getting licenses to do research studies is harder. They're certainly, because they're scheduled drugs, Schedule 1 drugs, it costs a lot of money, and it's difficult and complex to get permission to do research on them, but it's not impossible, and it's not blocked because of stigma. At least not, that's not the main reason. If we had the money, they would be over the line. Then that goes back to the other part of your question. Why would we not have the money? Why are big pharma not spending money on psychedelics? I think it's a bit of an urban myth amongst the psychedelic community that big pharma are suppressing it because they're terrified of the competition. We are nowhere near psychedelics being a competition for SSRIs. It's a multi-trillion-dollar industry with millions of people on SSRIs. I don't think that big pharma are suppressing psychedelics because they just don't fear any competition. They just don't see them as a competitor. The main reason they're not putting money into it is because they don't see them as a money spinner. In a way, psychedelic medicine is a marketing nightmare. It's a terrible idea. You only need to use the drug 2 or 3 times, and then you're better. It's a marketing nightmare, psychedelics. And this is, if we get on to talking about the contemporary psychedelic industry and what's happened in the last 5-10 years, part of the reason why we saw this big peak about 5-7 years ago, loads of money came pouring into psychedelics. Ironically, most of it from the Canadian and Californian cannabis industry. People who'd made their money in cannabis medicine decided to turn their attention to psychedelics, thinking they would make billions. Psychedelics and cannabis could not be more different. I mean, they get put in the same box because they're both recreational drugs, but from a medical practitioner point of view, they couldn't be more different. Cannabis is a daily maintenance drug that has to be taken every day, day out, day in, day out. You get someone onto cannabis as a medicine, you're going to make millions because they're going to carry on using it. Who's going to spend $150 million on getting MDMA over the line as a licensed medicine when it's off patent? Nobody owns MDMA. No one owns MDMA or psilocybin or LSD or 5-MeO-DMT or DMT. These are not patented drugs. These are not molecules that are owned by anyone. Who's going to put $150 million into all of that research to then come up with a licensed drug that's free anyway? And you only have to take it once or twice or 3 times and then never again, and you're better. And so it's not that... I don't think it's that the pharma industry fear psychedelics. I just think they can't be bothered. There's no money to be made in them. It's a waste of money to put all that money into something that they're not going to reap back their R&D costs on. When you make a new Prozac or a cannabis product, or I don't know, Viagra or one of these wonder drugs that you use frequently, you reap back your $150 million of R&D costs because you've got patients on maintenance drugs. Psychedelics are not maintenance drugs. They're a marketing nightmare. And that's why we saw this peak of all sorts of clinics, like the one where I worked in the UK. We opened the UK's first medical psychedelic clinic. Lots of money came pouring in, and then it just wasn't possible to make any revenue because it's very expensive to deliver psychedelic therapy. And so far, nobody really has come up with a decent, viable economic model that makes it worth spending money on setting up psychedelic therapy clinics.
It's so funny because this brings us right back to the beginning of the conversation with the NHS and how expensive it is for medicine. Well, if you have, for example, MDMA, where you have, 3 sessions with it and you just keep seeing healing, progressing, or, Iboga or whatever the thing is, then that's a patient-centric model. But as you said, you can't get rich out of that. So how do we fix the healthcare systems of the world? We bolster the proactive elements, and then you're left with pediatric cancer and trauma medicine and these areas that do need a lot of research and funding.
So this is great that we've come around to this, because we've come around to me completely contradicting myself. And I'm glad, because this is where I wanted us to land. Whilst there's no money to be made from a profit-driven business of psychedelic provision, what we do know, and I say this in my talks all the time, there is nothing more expensive than the untreated psychiatric patient. Psychiatric patients cost millions over a lifetime. if you allow that person in their teens with mild anxiety and depression or PTSD to germinate into a full-blown psychiatric patient, they will cost millions over a lifetime. Every time they go into hospital, it's £10,000 a week. They offend, they go to prison, they don't work, they're on disability benefits. The family law courts take away their children, they don't work. Transgenerational unemployment because of sub-treated or untreated transgenerational mental illness. So we know it's very, very expensive to not treat mental health properly. So this is where you look at then psychedelics. So suppose a course of MDMA therapy cost, I don't know, suppose it cost £40,000, £30,000. That's a lot of money, and a hell of a lot more money than a packet of Prozac, which is like £2.80 for 30 tablets. So we're not. So then that makes people think psychedelics are too expensive to deliver. Psychedelic therapy doesn't work. We can't afford to pay for these expensive 2 therapists, 12, 16 weeks. But it's preventative medicine, because if that £30,000 halts that 20-year-old from becoming a lifelong psychiatric patient, you will reap back that £30,000 very quickly. So the answer, going back to the beginning of our conversation, what's our magic wand to fix the mental health care system? It's people with very far-reaching understanding of preventative medicine. That yes, psychedelics are an expensive upfront cost, but there's been some recent good health economic analyses done with MDMA and psilocybin, and they are hugely beneficial and value for money. Hugely value for money. Because if you prevent that trajectory into a lifelong mental health psychiatric career patient, you will more than mop up that expensive upfront cost. And it is expensive. And when a GP's got, a queue of people with depression and anxiety, and he's just writing, or he or she is endlessly writing scripts for Prozac for £3 a shot, to get that GP to put his or her hand into their pocket to spend 40 grand on MDMA therapy, it seems like they're not going to do it. But then if you ask that GP, what will happen with these patients who are being fobbed off with Prozac scripts, and they've been in mental health services for 40 years, they will have cost millions, millions and millions. So the answer is an enlightening look at the economic value of psychedelics, an appreciation that they are an expensive upfront cost, they are an invasive upfront cost, and that the pharma industry are probably not going to meet those costs because there's no pharma money to be made in it. So who's going to meet those costs? Who's going to pay that £40,000? It has to be public healthcare systems, really. Has to be public healthcare systems, because they're the ones that are going to reap the benefits of bringing down that epidemic of mental illness that not only is morally, ethically, clinically wrong, but is also economically wrong for the public purse.
There's an interesting comparison that I talk about a lot here. We have devolved as a profession. And a lot of us in the US are firefighters and also paramedics. So we, jack of all trades, master of none. These men and women are running, 24 hours straight, usually on everyone's worst day. And the work week initially is 56 hours a week. So you do a 24-hour shift and a 48-hour period off, and then rinse and repeat for 10, 20, 30 years. And there's obviously, I don't have to, illustrate this too much. Over time, we have seen this just completely fall apart. The mental health crisis, physical health crisis, recruitment crisis, financial crises as people don't want to do this anymore, there's more overtime. And now these men and women are working 80 hours a week because they're forced to stay another shift. And what has kind of emerged from this as a huge solution, as it were, one of the solutions is to simply say, all right, we're going to invest and put a fourth shift, and we're going to bring it down to a 42-hour work week. And there's been a revolution here in Florida where in the last 2 years, 9 departments have gone to this because they realize all the money that we're losing in overtime, in training people who then leave, in lawsuits from mistakes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Why don't we just front load that money, fill all those vacancies, and now we'll actually be saving money. It's the same exact thing, not even just in the mental health, but I see in the NHS. If you did these mental health treatments, what would be the impact on obesity? knowing that people, that's a way of filling the void, is food. What about cancer? Knowing that stress is related to cancer. So even all the other ailments that are crippling the NHS, so many of those would be improved as well if we were able to move the needle on the British mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and this is not new, the idea of prophylactic medicine or public healthcare that is preventative rather than just firefighting and mopping up the problems later. This is not new as a concept, but we've dug ourselves into such a hole now with the epidemic crisis that psychedelic medicine is finding it very hard to get off the ground, because you have to be very far-reaching and creative to spend that 40 grand on an MDMA patient. But if we kept spending it on lots of people in their early years, we would save lots of money further down the line, and everyone would be happier too. So, but going back to the finances of this, usually we'd look to the pharma industry for this because they've got millions and they produce the product, and they're more than happy to produce the product because they're going to reap back their R&D costs. If they're not going to reap back their R&D costs, why would they bother producing the product? And the answer is they wouldn't. And the answer is they haven't. And that's why we've seen this kind of rise and then collapse of a psychedelic industry. And I'm not quite sure what the answer is to bring it back. Because I know as a socialist and certainly as a hippie, I shouldn't have to care about commercialization. But as a realist, you do, because if something's not profitable and commercially viable, it's just not going to happen in this world. So we talk about the evils of satisfying shareholders, etc. But if we don't satisfy shareholders, then the company collapses, and that's that, you know? So whilst, you know, the psychedelic world, and certainly my world of socialism and being a hippie, it revolves around shunning those things, realistically, if the business doesn't work, you don't get the treatment. So it has to be profit driven. It has to be profit driven. And Rick Doblin's used up all the philanthropists now. There's no more donors left. People don't want to donate anymore. They want to invest. And so we need to make it so it's investable. We need to get the people with the big bucks to give us $10 million. And you're only going to do that if you can give them back $12 million in 5 years' time. They're not going to donate anymore. And so to do that, we need to create viable economic industries with psychedelics that make money so we can do good.
Or conversely, again, if you have nations that are bleeding trillions of dollars because of healthcare costs, do we need to make money, or can we actually proactively invest? We have no problem sending, weapons overseas for all kinds of horrible things. What if, as a nation, we band together and say, all right, we will invest X amount in creating these treatments for our people, knowing that our healthcare costs are then going to start shrinking dramatically. So rather than do we always have to make more money, or can we be more efficient, and fiscally sound and proactively invest at the front door, which will save us, for years and years and years? Because if you look at the healthcare costs when we were children compared to now, I guarantee you they were, a fraction of what people pay today.
Yeah, which is what we talked about at the beginning, the complexity of today's technological healthcare system. And there are certain nations that seem to be doing this better than others. And a lot of the Nordic nations have a much more creative and aspirational understanding of this. And as a result, they have very high taxes. You pay a lot of tax, but they're investing it in the future in ways that other nations are not doing so much. It's going to be really interesting to see how the psychedelic renaissance is going to play out in the next 5 years. Because just to plug my book for a second, I first wrote the book in 2012 when there was not, there was research going on around the world, and there was university departments and small pockets of academic research. I then did a second edition in 2017 where that had moved on to more and more academic departments. But then the reason I've done this third edition, which is coming out next month, the third edition of Psychedelic Renaissance, is so much has happened in the last 8 years, beyond recognition from 2017. We didn't have a psychedelics industry. We just had a academic university-based research program. which was doing well. But as I said, all this money came pouring in, and all these clinics opened, all sorts of new ventures, and a lot of them have collapsed or merged, or are struggling. Because I think, from my understanding of it, is the investors who'd come from cannabis suddenly realized that it's not like cannabis. It's really a lot more expensive to deliver, and the outcomes are a lot slower because you don't have to do so much. It's not a maintenance treatment. And so you need people to invest economically and also in terms of resources now, so that it will save money in 20 years. Now, that's always a hard sell to investors, but it's doable. It's doable with certainly with healthcare systems for whole nations who can see that wider picture. But I'm interested to see how it's going to happen in the next 5 years. I mean, one of the things that we've seen growing a lot in the last 5 years, since the clinic system kind of collapsed to some extent, is we've seen loads of psychedelic education. Psychedelic training and education is where people are making some money at the moment. So that's been promising. And loads of people are offering how to become a psychedelic therapist, and all the training centers. Another thing that's grown hugely is the underground. And then a gray area, which we call the sort of wellness industry, in which drugs like psilocybin or ayahuasca or ibogaine, or indeed MDMA, are offered under the radar for in retreats. Now, one of the difficulties with this is because they're not on the public healthcare system and they're underground, literally they're off the radar, they tend to be very expensive and exclusive. And, one thing I've said in talks recently is, we will have failed with the psychedelic renaissance if after all this time, all these decades, all we're doing is providing exciting trip experiences for tech billionaires in Jamaica and Costa Rica in, luxurious yurts. That would be a failure of the psychedelic renaissance, in my opinion. It's not bringing the medicine to the people who need it. Those huge swathes of low social economic status groups with, as we discussed at length, with all of the mental health problems, the high prevalence of mental health problems. So have we failed? I don't think we failed. It's all part of the journey. But until we get psychedelics free for the public in nationally approved public healthcare systems, we will not have achieved the goal of a psychedelic renaissance.
Winston Churchill once said, you can measure the greatness of a nation by the health of its people. And I think when you look at Scandinavia, they might have a higher tax, requirement, but it's a very healthy nation. And we talk about their education, their prison systems, their resilience to COVID. I mean, so many areas where they're just doing things really well. And I think it comes to humility. The places like the UK, the USA need to be going to those nations, Portugal. What are you doing? It's not apples to apples. Your country is the size of one of our states, but how can we apply this? How can we take this blueprint and use it in our system too? Because if in the UK and the US, if we look and our nation has got fatter and sicker and, the mental health is getting worse, insanity is doing the same thing, expecting different results. So we need to do something differently and proactively investing, whether it's, MDMA-led, therapy, or whether it's simply putting real food back in schools, or ideally all of these things simultaneously. We were a healthy nation for millennia until modern society came around. So we can take the good things from technology, apply it with some of this ancient wisdom, and create an even better system moving forward.
Yeah, it's absolutely doable. And, in many ways, we don't need any more psychedelic research. We've demonstrated the safety and efficacy of MDMA and psilocybin and DMT and 5-MeO DMT and ketamine. And, we don't need to do the safety and efficacy studies anymore. We just need really good PR. We just need to sell this to the people who can make the decisions about implementing public healthcare systems that use these. And that's what is happening. And, going back to the beginning of this interview, what's changed? There are a great many positives that have happened since 2018, since we last met, in terms of tackling that stigma and bringing this into the public consciousness. But in terms of us being there, I would love for us now, 7-8 years after the first session that we had, for me to be saying, oh, it's fantastic, you can now get MDMA on the NHS. We're not there. I would love it if in 5 or 8 years we come back and that is the case. Then we really will have moved forward. We really will.
Absolutely. Well, your book, the third edition, The Psychedelic Renaissance, so you've got multiple other books as well. Where are the best places to find that book, and what is the exact release date as well?
So it's on a publisher called Aeon Books, or Aeon, Aeon, UK-based publisher. It's a terrific book. I'm really proud of it. I've been writing this for about 1.5 years. It's a big, thick textbook. It's going to hopefully be in every university department on all the curricula for medical students and trainee psychiatrists, as the go-to book on psychedelics, because a lot of books have got the history of Albert Hofmann and Timothy Leary, and a lot of good books have got the pharmacology, how the drugs work. A lot of the books have got the culture, indigenous uses, and historically how these drugs have impacted on culture and music and art and all of that. And the Psychedelic Renaissance book has that, but I don't think there's any other book that documents the industrial changes of the last 15, 20 years as this book does. So you really do learn about these ups and downs of legalization, legislation, approvals, and it's a kind of work in progress. And, it's already out of date, because it's not even published, but it's already out of date, because every week, every day, I'm seeing more and more studies coming in, clinics opening, clinics closing, new retreats starting, retreats shutting. It's such a dynamic business. And as I said, it's going to be really interesting to see what it's like in another 5 years. I'll have to write another one. God, I don't look forward to that. But no, I'm really, really proud of it. And it's going to be coming out in hardback on Aeon Books. I've got a Substack group about it called the Psychedelic Renaissance. And I've been posting regular excerpts from all the chapters over the last few months. I'm speaking at the Hay Book Festival on psychedelics in a couple of months. And yeah, this is a very well-timed interview because it's just about to come out.
Brilliant. Well, Ben, I want to thank you so much. Another incredible conversation, an exciting conversation. I think these are the renaissance that I've talked about, I think is coming, is one of kindness, compassion, empathy, and community. And this is part of this entire conversation. The way we bring people together is we get them to heal. I really believe that. And this is going to be one of the most powerful tools. So I want to thank you so much for coming back onto the Behind the Shield podcast and being so generous with your time today.
Well, thank you, James. As usual, lots of difficult and penetrating and stimulating questions, and probably developing more questions than answers between us. But it's really, really important to thrash these things out, isn't it? And let's hope that next time that I come back and talk to you, we've got some really positive things to talk about in terms of what we've achieved with psychedelic medicine.